Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is David Graysboard. I'm from the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies, a very strong unit, which often punches above its weight, as several of you know. By the way, it's nice to see both familiar and unfamiliar people. This is the Rabbi Marcus Breger Memorial Lecture. It's a lecture, really a lecture series. We've had it for a number of decades. Those of you who are longtime Tucsonans know that Rabbi Breger was instrumental in the formation of Judaic Studies at the university. That's really an understatement. He was one of the founders of Judaic Studies. So we are here largely because of him and the generosity of his heirs and his children. Esther Netter is one who deserves thanks. He has been our main contact with the family, and also Judy Citron, another daughter of Rabbi Breger, and finally David Feuerstein. So these are the people who made this possible for all of us. I would be remiss if I didn't thank Jackie Schmidt, our program coordinator, who's worked at all the logistics and publicity as well, and our student workers, Colby Mason and Fernanda Charles, who are always helpful. And you may notice this is long after school has concluded for the evening, so they're here to make things work. Before I introduce tonight's Breger speaker, I wanted to mention a number of events with which you may be. What's the proper way to say it? In which you may be interested. Yes, you're interested in them, not with them. You're interested in them. From November the 1st through the 3rd, that's the weekend, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies will be having a conference in person and on Zoom on Middle Eastern science fiction in translation. They will have several speakers on Zoom, 2 of whom are Israelis, 1 of whom is a Palestinian, and many others from the area for a look at the Near East that, avoids the usual brouhaha. So I have information about that. If you're interested, this will be held at the CMES, but again, there's a way you can zoom in. In addition to that, CMES, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, will be featuring a film entitled Beyond October 7, and that will take place on November 7th at 6:30 p.m. on campus at the ILC room at the U of A, close to the U of A library. Beyond October 7 is a documentary by Jasmine Caney. She will be available later for a Zoom conversation about the film, and it's about the survival of a family who underwent the horrors of October 7th, 2023. The discussion that on the 7th will be led by my colleague, Professor Annette Balint, who's the inaugural holder of the Jeffrey Plevin Chair in Modern Israel Studies. The Sally and Ralph Duchin Memorial Lecture Series, which is one of our endowed series, will continue on Monday, November the 18th at 2 p.m. on Zoom. We will have a live virtual conversation with Professor Balint and with an Israeli director by the name of Ran Tal on his film Children of the Sun. That film will be also screened. It's a documentary about children who experienced growing up in the earlier kibbutzim, the very sort of hardcore communist and other socialist kibbutzim, and they have a unique perspective on what it means to be Israeli, what it means to be Jewish, and so forth. There'll be on December 4th at 2 p.m. on Zoom. There'll be a live virtual conversation between Professor Balint and Jasmine Caney, the director and producer of Beyond October 7th. So if you missed the earlier screening and conversation, you can tune into this. The registration is accompanied. Your registration is accompanied by a free link to that streaming. Finally, on Monday, February the 24th, we will have the Jeffrey Plevin Memorial Lecture with Shlomi Eldar and Yuval Biton. Shlomi Eldar is a prominent Israeli journalist. Some of you may have been available for some of the events he has done with us in the past. Yuval Biton is a former member of the Internal Security Service. He is the man who diagnosed the brain tumor of Yihya Sinwar, and he is very much familiar with the man and his mentality. So both of them will be speaking with Professor Balint about the ideology of Hamas, the policies of Hamas, and prospects for the Gaza Strip. So please mark your calendars. Okay, now for the main course. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Lisa Leff, Professor Lisa Leff, who is the director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Essentially, this means that Professor Leff supervises all research at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Before joining the museum, Professor Leff spent nearly 2 decades as a professor, first at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, and then at American University in Washington, D.C. She's still at American University as a professor of history. She has also won various teaching awards, both in Texas and at D.C. At AU, she was named Scholar Teacher of the Year. Dr. Leff, Professor Leff, is a historian of modern European and modern Jewish history. Her research focuses on the Jews of modern France from the time of the French Revolution to the present. She's especially interested in the history of archives, modern political ideas, nationalism, internationalism, imperialism, etc., anti-Semitism, another subject in which she has done research. I could go on, but this is a lengthy record. Let me just point out some of the titles of her recent works. An article with the title "Liberalism and Anti-Semitism: A Reassessment from the Peripheries." This appears in a book entitled "Jews, Liberalism, Anti-Semitism: A Global History." Came out in 2021. A book that she co-edited is entitled "Colonialism and the Jews." Came out in 2017, and it was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. The work from which she will be drawing her presentation tonight is entitled "The Archive Thief: The Man Who Salvaged French Jewish History in the Wake of the Holocaust." And it's a book from 2015 that was awarded the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, was the finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and has received amazing praise from various corners. So tonight, Professor Leff will be speaking about, quote, "The Archive Thief: The Man Who Salvaged French Jewish History in the Wake of the Holocaust." I imagine that the presentation will be about 45 minutes or thereabouts, and then we will open this up to Q&A. Please keep your questions brief. Silence all your beeping and chiming devices, please, and welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to David for hosting me. It has been a lot of fun to be here today. Thank you to Judaic Studies. Thank you to Jackie. And thank you to the family of Rabbi Marcus Breger, who made this lecture tonight possible. So I'm going to talk to you about a funny story, a strange story of a Jewish historian who became an archive thief. And I thought I would start just by telling you a little bit about how I got interested in this story. I first stumbled on the story of this man when back many, many years ago, when I was actually doing research for a totally different book. It was my dissertation, in fact, which was just on Jews in 19th century France. And when I went to France to do my research, I found the strangest thing. I would be looking for documents related to stuff about 19th century French Jews. I would look in synagogue archives or in public archives like the National Archives. And the stuff that was on the inventories, if I would place my order, often would come back with the note, not here. Ça manque à sa place, missing. And, when this happens once or twice, maybe it's a coincidence, but this happened quite a bit in many different kinds of places. And soon enough, I was asking around, and I heard the strangest thing. A historian who, like me, had come from America, but years before, had stolen them. And I asked also archivists, historians, everybody knew this story. And they knew his name. It was a very actually prominent man named Zosa Szajkowski. And let me, because I bet you're like, how do you spell that? Szajkowski. Eventually, I should say, Szajkowski got caught stealing rare pamphlets from the New York Public Library, and in the wake of that, committed suicide. This was the story I heard back many years ago. To me, this was kind of fascinating. I knew of Szajkowski because there was no way that you could work in this field that David and I both work in of modern Jewish history with an interest in France without encountering this name, Zosa Szajkowski. Szajkowski started publishing works of French Jewish history back in the 1940s, when basically no professional historian, no university-based historian was working in this field of French Jewish history at all. He published in 5 languages. He published scores of articles, over 100 articles, over a dozen books, at a time when no one else was doing this kind of original, archivally based research in the field. Now, like most Jewish historians of his generation, he was born in 1911, Szajkowski never held an academic post. He actually didn't even have a doctorate. And yet, David and I talked about this last night. His studies today are still considered indispensable to scholars, even though he died in 1978. We consider them foundational. So when I heard these stories in Paris, I was really shocked and intrigued, right? All that scholarship, those scores and scores of articles, they were based on stuff he stole from the archives, right? This book began as kind of a quest just to get to the bottom of this question: why would he do it? And then the more I thought about it over the years, because I was teaching a class on history and memory, and I thought, oh, this kind of is related. Thinking through the issues, I realized Szajkowski would never have done what he did, steal documents from so many archives, if there hadn't been willing buyers. Because what he did involved, of course, stealing from certain libraries and selling to others. So the libraries, especially the ones that he sold to, were tacitly involved as well. So this second question started percolating for me, and it seemed just as important as the first, right? Because there's one thing, the question of the thief himself, Szajkowski, and then there's, well, what's up with these institutions, the ones that lost archives and the ones that bought them? So what I want to do tonight, and what I do in the book, The Archive Thief, is sketch out the answers to those questions that I started with. Why did he do it? And why did the libraries and archives participate, wittingly or unwittingly, in these thefts? Let me start the story with Szajkowski as a young man. Here he is as a young man in Paris in the 1930s. It's here that Szajkowski first got interested in Jewish archives and Jewish history. I should say, back up for a moment. Szajkowski was born in Poland in 1911, and he came to Paris as a young man in 1927 when he was 16 years old. He came without his parents. He was from that sector of Jewish society in Poland, super poor, very, very poor at a time when Polish Jewry was getting poorer and poorer. And he, like many young Polish Jews at that time, saw no future in Poland economically, and he followed some older brothers. He had some much older brothers who had already established themselves in Paris, and he went there too. When he got there, he was farthest thing from a scholar you can imagine. He worked as a watchmaker. He worked in the garment industry, just like his brothers. That was 1927, but by the 1930s, when this picture is taken, he had emerged as something else. He wanted to be a writer. He had these aspirations to be something different. And he started writing articles in the daily Jewish Yiddish language communist newspaper called the Naya Presse in Paris. And he was writing on all sorts of topics. He was writing journalism about what was going on in the garment industry and taking little tours of Paris. And he was increasingly getting interested in history. He discovered actually this world of other Yiddish-speaking Eastern European immigrants who were at that time based in Paris, pioneering a new field, Jewish history based on archival documentation. And he was just so interested in it. You can see in his journalism a movement towards this kind of work. Why? Well, here's the people who inspired him. There are a couple, Elias and Riva Cherikover. And they, as you can see in this picture, they're a generation older than Szajkowski. Cherikover, Elias Cherikover, the man, was the head of the historical section of an institution that still exists today called YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, that you might know now it's based in New York, but when it was founded in 1925, it was based in Vilna. Cherikover himself had never been based in Vilna, but he was the head of the history department of the YIVO, and he had basically started breaking new ground through this institute, writing Jewish history on the basis of documents. Now, the way that Cherikover conceived of the purpose of Jewish history, this kind of professionalized, scientific Jewish history, was a little different than many historians have it today. For him, the project of collecting documents and doing history based on documents was it's a passion project. In fact, he thought doing history was absolutely essential for the survival of the Jewish people. He thought in the 1930s, he already thought it in the 1920s, that Jewish people, if they were facing an existential threat. And the response to that was to do scholarship. The way he thought about the threat is kind of interesting, and you can see the imprint of this on Szajkowski. On the one hand, Jews in Eastern Europe, before he came to Paris, what he saw was that Jewish life was changing really rapidly. The Jews were leaving behind the old small towns, the shtetls that they were living in, and moving to big cities. They were losing their knowledge of the old ways, the old culture. And if they were going, he was not a man who was against modernizing. He knew this was something you couldn't fight. He was also like a guy committed to modern rationality. So it's not like he was nostalgic for continuing to live the past. But he thought that if Jews are going to survive, they need to know where they came from. They needed to know their traditions. And for him, studying the past and collecting stories from the past was absolutely essential if Jews were going to know who they were. So he went around with a team all over Eastern Europe collecting records from the old Jewish communities that people were leaving, even writing down old legends, stories, songs, and putting them into an archive. So in a way, we can say the beginning of Cherikover's passion, right, of this whole world, why did they care about Jewish history? It's a kind of Jewish nationalism, right? Not Zionism. It's not aimed at moving Jews to a different place, but it's a kind of nationalism that Jews are people and need to know their culture, and history was central to that. I want to say one more thing about Cherikover, because this is really important for Szajkowski too. Cherikover was living in Ukraine during the Russian Revolution and during World War I. And you may not know, but right after World War I, there was this horrible wave of pogroms in Ukraine. In fact, scholars tell us now that something like over 200,000 Jews were killed in these unprecedented atrocities. The way that people talked about it then, this was starting right after the Russian Revolution, after World War I, during the Russian Civil War, right during the civil war that followed the Russian Revolution. People talked about these atrocities as unprecedented. They used language that we now associate with the Holocaust. There's a scholar who's even called it the Holocaust before the Holocaust. Cherikover was there. He saw these atrocities taking place, and his response was, we must document this. Because he actually believed in the Russian Revolution and its ideals, and he believed that this Russian Revolution was going to finally put an end to anti-Semitism. And he thought there would be justice, right? Just needed to be documented, and these documents would have to go to Moscow to be, right, to prove what had happened. So it was this giant project of collecting documents and firsthand testimony from victims, right, in order to prove what had happened. Well, sadly, all this stuff that had been collected never got used in Moscow. And instead, disheartened, Elias Cherikover, together with his wife and actually completely equal partner, Riva Cherikover, left Moscow with their giant collection of archives and went to Berlin, where they proceeded to start this giant project of publishing this documentation that they had gathered. Okay, so all of this big, long story is to say, it's not just for Jewish nationalism that Cherikover believed in Jewish history. He also thought that if you documented crimes, if you documented them objectively and carefully, there could be justice. And if there wasn't that justice in the Soviet Union, there would be justice somewhere else. So this is what Cherikover was doing in Berlin in the 1920s. When Hitler comes to power, the Cherikovers moved to Paris in 1933. And this is what they're doing when a young Zosa Szajkowski meets them. So here's this young guy, Zosa Szajkowski. He is kind of in the communist movement. He is fighting for justice as a kind of what the Jews then called Linke, as a left-winger. But when he meets the Cherikovers, he gets a very different idea. He can fight for justice through scholarship, right? That's where he gets his passion for history. And he gets so excited because what Cherikover and Yivo offer him is they're doing this kind of radical new program where outside of a university, they're offering fellowships so that young scholars can learn how to do really serious historical research. And he applies for a fellowship to full-time do scholarship on the history of the Jewish immigrants in France, which is what he is. He wants to do a whole history of that. And he receives this very prestigious fellowship, and he quits his job, and he's all set to go. And it's for the 1939-1940 school year to start on September 1st, 1939. Does anybody, I feel that you know what this date is, right?
Yeah.
So the Nazis invade Poland. 2 days later, the French declare war on the Nazis, and World War II begins. No chance to have a fellowship. This whole world around the Cherikovers that's doing Jewish history based on documents flees to the four winds. The Cherikovers quickly go to New York. Szajkowski makes his way there too, arriving on one of the last boats to leave France. He arrives in New York in September 1941. just a few months before it would become impossible to make such a journey. And pretty quickly, as soon as he can, Szajkowski signs up for the United States Army to go back to Europe to fight the Nazis. He served as an interpreter or translator and a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne. The 82nd Airborne was one of those units that jumped into Normandy on the night before D-Day, doing advanced reconnaissance. Szajkowski jumped with them and spent all of 1944 and most of 1945 in service translating because, of course, he was Polish born, so he spoke Polish, Yiddish, German, French, and English. He found pretty quickly that as a native Polish speaker, he also could deal with Russian, which made him actually a really valuable translator for the US forces. Fighting his way across France, he wound up by the summer of 1945, after the end of the war, staying in Berlin, working as a translator at Allied Command. So at Allied Command, you had the Russians, you had the English, you had the French, and you had the Americans. And what they had to do was interact every day with Germans. So these are all languages that Szajkowski spoke, and that's why he was able to work at Allied Command. And how did he spend his time? Well, when he was in France already, he had spent, there's this great book in French history called What Soldiers Do, and it's about what American troops did in their free time in France. Szajkowski didn't go around cavorting with women, like so many of his fellow soldiers. What he did instead was search out documentation. In France, he went and gathered records pertaining to the underground activities of Jews fighting in the resistance, and also records pertaining to the persecution of Jews in France. And with everything he found, he sent it to YIVO's new headquarters in New York, knowing that he wanted to make a life in the United States and wanting to preserve these items for scholars to work on in the future, including himself. When he got to Berlin and spent 6 months there, he spent every minute of free time going to bombed out, abandoned Nazi government buildings. So this is a picture of Szajkowski in the basement, in the ruined basement of the Nazi propaganda ministry. And he is just, you see the mess that this thing is in. He's just going through stuff and packing out immense amounts of documentation that he's sending home again to the YIVO. The records at YIVO indicate that he sent an average of a package every single day he was there. In one of his letters, he says, the only limit on how much stuff I'm sending is how much rope I'm able to find to tie together the packages. He was packing this stuff up in any kind of paper that he could find and sending it all home. In my book, I describe this as practically a mania for gathering this Nazi documentation. Now, he sent all these documents through the Army post office. So obviously he's not hiding what he's doing from the authorities. But I should say right here that already, my book is called The Archive Thief. What he's doing here is the legality of it is questionable at best, right? Allied forces, including the Americans, had outlawed looting. You were not supposed to go around taking things from Germans, right? And in addition, you were especially not supposed to take cultural items. And in fact, many other servicemen who did this kind of thing, like there were servicemen who stole the crown jewels of Hesse in this time, like American servicemen, they were prosecuted and the stuff was returned to Germany. There was really quite a bit of discipline around this. And yet, here's Szajkowski taking a picture of himself, proudly doing it. And I should say one more issue is that, of course, these are the very documents that the US and its allies were going to want to use in the war crimes trials that they were starting to prepare. And yet Szajkowski does not seem to care, right? He's emptying out these ministries with the stuff that he thinks is relevant. And I think, we can understand why Szajkowski did this. All that long story I told you about the Cherikovers is the answer. He thought, if we are going to prove what happened, we need the documentation. We need to show that the Nazis, in their own words, are the ones, what they had in mind. But more interesting to me, right, so that was kind of straightforward why Szajkowski did what he did. And it even tells us something about why American Jews back in New York who received these archives celebrated him. So I found articles in the Yiddish press in New York saying, our hero in Europe sending all this stuff. Now we're going to be able to show what the Nazis did. But why did the Americans let him do this? I want to take a little side detour to tell you something about the context, which I think explains this. Because as it turns out, Szajkowski was not the only American carrying out this kind of salvage operation in post-war Germany in 1945. You may know that the Nazis, when they went across Europe, looted lots of Jewish cultural property. They looted stuff from synagogues, like you see these Torah scrolls. They looted furniture. They looted priceless works of art. And they looted every Jewish library that they got their hands on. They looted big Jewish public libraries. They looted synagogue libraries. And they even looted libraries of individuals, large collections. And when the Americans, British, and Russians were coming in, liberating Germany, they stumbled on many, many stockpiles of this loot in salt mines, in castles, in caves. And they pledged that they were going to return everything if they could. So instead of just leaving it to the Germans, right, they centralized this stuff and they had a plan that they were going to return it. It's just that as it turned out, the amount of stuff they found was much bigger than they expected. So the books alone, 3 million books is what the Allies stumbled on. And they were not necessarily all marked where they came from. And many, many of these books were in languages that none of the servicemen could read. They were in Jewish languages. They were in Hebrew. They were in Yiddish. None of the Americans working in the depot where all these books got put could even read Jewish languages, much less know where they went. So when Szajkowski's in Berlin doing his one-man, I'm going into Nazi ministries, sending stuff back, simultaneously, there's a question about what's going to happen to all this stuff. Is it going to get left to the Germans? US policy at that time said, we're going to send stuff back to the countries that it came from when we can identify that and let the countries deal with it. What that meant outraged Jews based in New York who knew that so much of this stuff had been looted from Eastern Europe. You're going to send back stuff to Poland. You're going to send back stuff to Lithuania where there's no Jews left. What will come of this stuff? Who will use it? Books that will not have readers. And they prized these collections. So all of this stuff is in a holding pattern. And Szajkowski knew that. He knew that there was a really big chance that the Allies were never going to return this stuff, didn't understand that the Jews had a specific desire to reclaim their cultural property, and it was just going to be lost. And that's part of what empowered him, right, to think, I'm a one-man salvage operation, because the Allies can't be trusted. There were other Jews from other parts of the Jewish world who were doing similar things, maybe not quite as illegally, but, here's the depot that the Americans used to put all those books. It was outside of Frankfurt in a little town called Offenbach. You may have heard of Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. Well, she had come to New York in 1940 herself from France, and she, working together with the great Jewish historian Salo Baron, then based at Columbia University, they didn't do anything illegal like Szajkowski did. They worked the legal channel. They lobbied the State Department saying, those Jewish books that you found, do not send them to Eastern Europe where nobody will be able to see them. Do not leave them in Germany. These things must go where the new centers of Jewish population are. Hannah Arendt was really so straightforward in her lobbying the US government. She said, Jewish life in Europe is over. It will not grow there. We need to get this stuff out. We need to get it primarily to the United States, maybe also to Palestine. This was 1946. It's uncertainty about the future of Palestine. Other centers of Jewish population. Eventually, I should say, they founded a nonprofit called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, Inc. that was founded in order to make this request. And an amazing thing happened. In 1947, the US government authorized this nonprofit to take charge of all of the books that were left in that depot that they weren't able to find original owners of. And so Jewish Cultural Reconstruction from 1947 to 1952 took those books from Offenbach, these books, and redistributed them to new centers. United States, the new state of Israel after it was founded, and also other new centers of Jewish life in Latin America, in South Africa, in Australia. One place that they did not go was back to Europe, right? So now if you go to the great Jewish libraries in the United States, you can sometimes see the stamp of Jewish cultural reconstruction because many, many books that originated in Europe that had been looted by the Nazis came here. So that's kind of the mentality of these Jewish leaders in New York, that back in 1945, when Szajkowski was stealing, that completely fit with what they had in mind. And people in leadership in the American government, they didn't yet have the policies in place, but they were letting Szajkowski do it because everybody knew that sometimes the law does not perfectly map on to what's right. And this was one of those cases where it was more convenient to look the other way and let Szajkowski do this, even though it was illegal. Does this make sense? The thing is, after World War II, so this is kind of the norm in World War II, or at the end of World War II, to treat Jewish cultural property as this special case. And eventually, the law did align with what was right? But after World War II, people like Hannah Arendt and Salo Baron did not keep going back to Europe to steal books and archives, right? They settled down in New York and wrote their books. Not Szajkowski. What I found was that when everybody else stopped doing this, stopped being a rescuer of Judaica, Szajkowski kept going back. Through the 1950s, he made many trips, several months each, to go back to Europe to do research because though he became an employee of the YIVO in New York, working as an archivist, he made many research trips to continue his research on, remember I said he wrote more than 100 articles and more than a dozen books. All of that research was based on these research trips that he made back to France. And it was on these trips that Szajkowski went into the back of synagogues and in the back of public archives and stole the tens of thousands of documents that he would later bring to the United States, use for his articles, and then sell to American Jewish research libraries where they are now held. Well, I want to take a minute to talk about how he was able to do this, because remember, we're also concerned with those French institutions that lost stuff. So one example of how he was able to do this, I think, kind of illustrates a lot about the context. I want to talk about the biggest Jewish library in Europe at the time, a very large library in Paris called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, where I did all of my dissertation research, or much of it. I found a correspondence in the back of the Alliance library that showed that the librarians there, pictured here, they suspected Szajkowski of stealing stuff from the reading room, like the books on the shelves in the reading room, as early as 1947. And they're writing to each other, what should we do, what should we do? And what did they do? They chose not to call the police, but instead wrote to friends in New York who helped them locate where the items had been sold, which was much of the stuff had been sold to the New York Public Library, and some other items had been sold to the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the biggest conservative seminary in America. Why did they handle it this kind of private way and not go to the police? There are two main reasons, and I think this tells us a lot about the context. One was the entire library had been looted by the Nazis in 1940, and it was recovered in Offenbach Archival Depot. So the books had just come back from Germany from being looted. 500,000 volumes. One thing that did not get returned, however, was the card catalog, which meant that through the whole 1950s, this staff was making a new card catalog. They had as volunteers at night, it was horrible conditions. They had no proof that they had ever had the books, right? So they certainly couldn't go to the police. And of course, the other reason is a little more obvious, and if sad. What would it look like in 1947 to go to the French police, who had, after all, many of them collaborated with the Nazis, and talk about a Jewish thief in a Jewish institution, right? What would that look like? Anti-Semitism did not disappear in 1945 in France. They did not want to fan the flames by involving the police. So they handled it privately, professionally, Jewish librarian to Jewish librarian. The New York Public Library wrote them back and said, yeah, we'll sell you back these volumes. We'll sell them back to you at cost. They bought them. Jewish Theological Seminary never wrote back. So they had some mild success this way, but what they were unable to do is prevent future thefts. So throughout the 1950s, Szajkowski was able to go around France, make friends with librarians and archivists, and the synagogues where he stole were ordinary synagogues. These were the working papers in the back. They weren't formal archives. Befriend and impress the archivists or the holders of these collections and take stuff. And then the fact that no one had ever gone to the police meant that Szajkowski continued to sell through the 1950s, and that these American Jewish research collections bought. New York Public Library continued to buy. Jewish Theological Seminary in New York continued to buy. Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary that trains Reform rabbis, bought a tremendous amount of stuff. So did Yeshiva University Library. So that's all the denominations. Everybody bought from Szajkowski up until the end of his life. Why did he do it? Well, when I look at the evidence of his crimes after the war, it's pretty obvious. Even if earlier, this is a man who was a rescuer of Jewish archives from World War II in a moment of catastrophe. After the war, this is a man who is trying to support himself in order to do scholarship at a time when you couldn't get an academic job, right? This is how he supported himself as a scholar working outside academia. And the money that he got from these libraries was, of course, only available because the libraries bought from him. So I want to just turn back around and finish with this question of why the libraries bought. The libraries that bought the largest collections from Szajkowski were JTS in New York. So here's one of the documents that they bought. and HUC, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. These, as I said, are the two largest seminaries in America, one of the Reform movement and one of the conservative movement. We're talking about tens of thousands of documents, right, that were sold to these two institutions. My quest was to figure out, why did these librarians buy? And of course, there's no document in the archive that's really going to tell you that. So where I turned instead is the mission of these libraries. And that's all over everything that they wrote in this period. These librarians felt that they were working at a tragic moment in Jewish history, when the great centers of Jewish learning in Europe had just disappeared. They believed strongly, and I think I'm very glad that they did, they believed that they had to take up the mantle of Jewish learning. You have to understand, America in this period, and since the 19th century, had always been considered kind of an intellectual wasteland in the Jewish world. American rabbis were not known for their great learning. They hadn't been. And now that those great European institutions were gone, these seminaries were trying to remake themselves to be centers of Jewish learning. And the libraries really mattered for that. So for that reason, they believed that it was an act of rescue to take everything that they possibly could. As stuff was appearing out of Europe, right, as Jewish cultural reconstruction was giving out books, they knew that they had the responsibility, right? Can you understand how they're seeing it? We must take care of, preserve all of this stuff that records our past. It's kind of like an extension of Cherikover, right? If we want to know who we are, where we came from, we can't let this material disappear. We need to be the basis of Jewish knowledge going forward. So they didn't ask questions. And in fact, when I talked to some of these librarians later in their lives and said, like, listen, I want to just show you guys one thing about this, okay? Do you see this document? This here? Right? I try to imagine the librarian who bought that. What does that say to you? Say louder.
Something is cut out.
Something is cut, right? What do you think is cut? If you saw that, what would you assume?
The location, where it's from.
Exactly. This is so obviously a stolen document. It's an ownership stamp, right? This is 1790 Strasbourg document about Jewish emancipation during the French Revolution. And it's got a big square cut. That is not like the kind of, old paper worn by time, right? That is a theft. Why would this librarian, who certainly knows that, buy it anyway? What he said to me, I talked to this librarian, and he said, I knew that if I didn't buy it, it wouldn't be in a place where scholars could get it, right? Everything that these librarians were dealing with had been through this cycle of looting, loss, destruction. When it's being offered and they're a place that can take care of it, they felt that obligation. So they didn't ask questions, and they bought lots of stuff, even though they knew. They knew it had shady origins. Everything, in their view, had shady origins. It's their job to take care of it. Does this make sense? Yeah. Right? It was because they saw themselves within a framework of rescue that they wind up buying items from a questionable guy like Szajkowski. Okay, before I finish, I want to address the question of the impact that these sales had on our study of the field. I want to show you some other documents too. Here's one that I wanted to show you because it has this interesting stamp on it. Do you see that? And maybe it's not in focus enough for you to be able to read what that stamp says, but it's an ownership stamp that says Zion Szajkowski. It's his name, Szajkowski's name stamp, which tells me that when he stole this stuff, this is an 18th century document from Alsace. It's a household inventory that he must have stolen from the public archives. And he just took it and he put his name stamp on it. And he sold it to Hebrew Union College, where you can now go see it. Here's another one where he he has this, with the red pencil, his own organizational system for the documents. What this tells me is he stole the stuff to use it at a time when he couldn't make photocopies, and then later when he needed money, sold these items. This is stuff from HUC also. And then finally, just to show you that he sold everywhere, it's not just one institution. This is a document that I found at Brandeis. And again, he wrote his name on this one in Yiddish. And I wanted to show you that it's kind of all over, because I wanted to make sure you understand how he sold. When Szajkowski stole, he would steal a whole collection from an archive. So let's say he was working on an article about the synagogues of Bordeaux. He would steal a bunch of stuff from a Bordeaux archive. And then when he was done with his article, he would break up the collection. So we would sell a few documents to Brandeis, a few to HUC in Cincinnati, a few to JTS in New York, and probably there's still some behind in Bordeaux. This has made it very hard to be a French Jewish historian. How are you supposed to know that you have to go to Cincinnati to find these documents? How are you supposed to re-put back together what was once together, right? A basic principle of archival science is you keep collections together. That's how we understand what something is. How is someone working in Cincinnati supposed to understand this document, much less read it, without the context? It's become totally decontextualized. And this is what historians really hold against Szajkowski. He's made it hard to understand these documents because they're not in the place where they were first archived. The only logic is him. You have to know his story to understand how to reconstruct. And yet, the long-term effect of this sale is not quite what you'd expect, because once these materials were in these collections in America, they actually give birth to the field of French Jewish history. It's actually at this time that you see the first university-based Ph.D.s on topics like the Jews of Bordeaux, the Jews of Alsace. And it's on the basis of these collections in the United States. When these things were still in France, nobody was working on them. And it's when they appear in these American collections, it's actually Americans who write the first university-based theses on these documents. Now you might say to me, as many of my French audiences say, well, these subtractions, though, surely resulted in a loss for the French. But it's actually weirdly the opposite. In the early 60s, the French became aware that Szajkowski was stealing and went to great pains to protect the remaining documents by cataloging them. And those synagogues, which used to just be working buildings, created archives in the back. And what that meant was all of a sudden, there's these new archives to work in. So French people started doing dissertations a little bit later than the Americans on French Jewish history. What you have on both sides of the Atlantic as a result of the thefts is the birth of the field of French Jewish history. So I'm going to end with this thought. Szajkowski's story is certainly ambiguous. On the one hand, we've got definitely a story of theft. Although his buyers thought they were rescuing Jewish history, they were in fact colluding in a work of theft. But on the other hand, even though we know Szajkowski was doing it for the money, the effects of his thefts were ultimately productive, laying the material as well as intellectual foundation for the field of French Jewish history. So in the end, it's not just Szajkowski's work as a scholar. Let's contemplate him here. It's not just his work as a scholar that makes him a founding father of French Jewish history. It was also his work as an archive thief. Thank you.